All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Want to welcome you today to our Hacking the Academy Fireside Chat with Dr. Emily Bender. My name is Verletta Kern. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the head of the Open Scholarship Commons and Digital Scholarship Librarian. And I wanted to start by welcoming you to our Open Scholarship Commons space. If you're not familiar with this space, we are a one-stop shop for knowledge creation services and support. As you'll see from folks joining us online, this is a hybrid space for researchers, instructors, and students to connect with the UW libraries and campus experts to do technology-intensive work across disciplinary boundaries and to work on sharing research openly with the world, which is what we'll hear a little bit about today. This event is part of the library's Hacking the Academy series, which UW students, faculty, and staff share new ways of working in higher education. And this is also the first event in our new Open Scholarship Commons Digital Storytelling Lab. This is a dynamic series for scholars, creators, and digital media enthusiasts to explore and master storytelling in all its forms. Each event combines an inspiring presentation, like the one we'll hear today, with hands-on workshops to ignite your creative projects. Please check our events calendar for more information about a certificate program and upcoming events. I'm going to turn it over to Madeline now to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Verletta. I'm Madeline Munt, she, her pronouns. I'm the head of the Research Commons over there in the Allen Library. The Research Commons is a group workspace that offers events designed for UW student researchers. A lot of graduate students, undergraduate researchers too can find their home there. We originally co-sponsored the Hacking the Academy event with the Open Scholarship Commons many years ago because so much of what we do is about interdisciplinary work and the ways that researchers, particularly student researchers in some cases, are shaking things up. So we love Hacking the Academy. And I also want to thank my original co-host of this event, Aubrey from the OSC, who's out with the flu unexpectedly. So thank you so much, Verletta, for stepping in and saving us. We're really excited about this. Now I'll pass it back to you to introduce Emily.
All right. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Emily Bender, who is a professor of linguistics and adjunct professor in the School of Computer Science and the Information School at the University of Washington, where she's been on faculty since 2003. Her research interests include multilingual grammar engineering, computational semantics, and societal impacts of language technology. She's the co-author of recent influential papers such as Climbing Towards NLU on Meaning, Form, and Understanding in the Age of Data from ACL 2020, and On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots, Can Language Models Be Too Big from FACT 2021, and the book with sociologist Dr. Alex Hanna, The AI Con, How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want, which is available for pre-order right now and is scheduled to be released May 13th, 2025. In her public scholarship, Bender brings linguistic insights to lay audiences to cut through the hype about AI and facilitate understanding of actual functionality of systems being sold under that name. In 2022, she was elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and in September of 2023, she was included in the first ever Time 100 AI list, highlighting 100 individuals advancing major conversations about how AI is reshaping the world. So I want to join me in welcoming Dr. Bender to this fireside chat today.
All right. Great, thank you, Verletta. We have a few questions prepared to get us started, and then we'll open things up to all of you in the room and everyone online. So Our first question is, why a podcast? And why is public engagement important to you in the first place?
Yeah, so the podcast is an accidental podcast, and I'll tell the story of how it came to be. But I think I got into public engagement first by being a listener on what was then Twitter, and I learned a lot from people who were doing public scholarship across many different fields, and really found that valuable. And I made a point of curating a feed where there was people who had a lot to share. I'm thinking of Ibyangi is her handle, Chandra, who was here actually as a postdoc in her primary field is astrophysics, but she also does work in African American studies, and she's written across those fields. I learned a lot from disability scholars online, and sort of that was a starting point. And then my first engagements actually online had to do with conferences. And Twitter was useful for sort of following what was happening in conferences that I couldn't be at, but also the back channeling was interesting. And I remember in 2016, I was back channeling about a conference that I was at. It was actually a workshop on representation learning, which is where we get things like word embeddings, which are a big part of language models. And everyone was talking about these representations. And so I was there on Twitter saying, representations of what? And as a result of being kind of a loudmouth on Twitter, I actually got invited to be on a panel discussion at that workshop. And I said, sure, when? They said 5 minutes. I was like, okay. So public scholarship, I think partially because I have benefited so much from other scholars' public scholarship, and also because it just feels meaningful to be able to take what linguistics can help with and bring it to the world. So why a podcast? So starting in 2019, I was getting particularly active reacting to hype around language models. It eventually turns into hype around AI. And I would sort of push off of newspaper articles and respond to them, or blog posts or other people's tweets. And then there was some like long form conference talk that was just full of hype. And so in one of my group chats, I was like, how do we handle this? Like what do you do if it's video? And Dr. Margaret Mitchell, Meg says, by the way, an alumna of the University of Washington. She studied in the computational linguistics, then Masters of Arts program. She said, we could do it Mystery Science Theater 3000 style. All right, now, I had never actually watched MST3K, but I knew the concept. And so a few months later, when there was this very long blog post by Google VP Blaise Aguirre-Arcas that was just, again, hyped top to bottom, and Medium says it was a 60-minute read. I was like, this is too long. I can't do this in text. Why don't we give this the MST3K treatment? Who's in, again, a group chat. And Dr. Alex Hanna, my co-host, who is a big fan of that show, said, I'm in. And so we did, actually, it was a live Twitch stream to start with. And she is active in roller derby, and one of the things that she does in roller derby is some like commentary and calling the games, and she knows about Twitch streaming from that. So we set up a Twitch stream, sort of through the sponsorship of the Distributed AI Research Institute. We managed to hire a live captioner, and thought we would be a one-off thing. Well, it took us 3 episodes of that to actually get through this long blog post, and then we thought, well, let's try something else. And so we had another stream where we invited some people who were experts on art, and so talking about this issue of so-called AI art. And 6 or 7 episodes in, we said, maybe this could be a podcast. So, accidental podcast.
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks.
I think this segues really nicely into our next question, which is how do you decide what topics you're going to cover, and how do you distribute that workload amongst you and the co-host?
Yeah, so it's the first thing we decide actually is our recording schedule. So we fix that. We do that about quarterly. We sort of compare calendars between me and Alex and our producer, Christy Taylor. And we find, we've settled on Mondays at noon for the live stream. And so we find the Mondays that work. And then when we have an episode coming up, there'll be something in the news, and we'll say, okay, can we get someone to come talk about this? Or we will have come across something that we're particularly annoyed with. Can we do this one this week? And I guess there's a little bit of we don't want to do sort of the same topic multiple times in a row. But it's probably about time, for example, to come around again to AI in medicine and AI in law, which we did early on. So there's sort of room for that to come back. we have, again, the group chats, right? Every time we see something horrendous, drop the link in the group chat, and I have this spreadsheet that's got over 1,000 rows now, and I need to go through the group chats. I've managed to cull links out of there through December 27th, and so I've got to dive in again. So sometimes, it'll be like something that we talked about there. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think clearly you have a lot of dedicated fans of the podcast here at UW based on the turnout in the room and online. But could you talk a little bit about what the overall response to the podcast has been?
Yeah, it's been really a wonderful experience on a couple of levels. So just to give you a sense of size of the audience, when we drop a new episode, when we do the live stream, we tend to have between, I think, 20 and 40 people joining us live, depending on timing and so on. When we drop a new episode, our first day downloads tend to be around 1,800, I think, for each episode. So that sort of is roughly the reach of it. And on one level, I love the community that has built up around it, that lots and lots and lots of our listeners say, I thought I was the only one who thought that this was all BS, and everyone around me is excited about it. Here are some people who see it how I do. And so that's sort of one thing. But then we will occasionally hear about policymakers and staffers of policymakers who listen to the podcast. There was one friend of a friend in municipal government who sent a list of a reading list around AI and had our podcast in it. And we were listed as coming from a think tank, which was kind of funny, but there's that. And I've had the good fortune to be invited out to the other Washington a couple times to talk with Congress people, and once to actually testify before a subcommittee. And on one of those trips, I was meeting with Senator Murkey's staff from Massachusetts, wonderful staffer named Ollie Stevenson, and he's pulled out a bunch of my papers and he's asking me informed questions about them, and then he asked me what I thought about open source in AI. And I said, actually, I don't really know yet, but there's an upcoming episode of my podcast where we're going to have some guests on talking about that, so I can recommend that. And he said, okay, I'm looking forward to listening to it. And I said, just be forewarned, the podcast is snarky and irreverent. And he said, oh, I know, I already listen. I was like, so that's been amazing.
Cool, thanks. Our next question, and I'll hand you the mic in a second, but I realize I forgot to thank Elliot, who's sitting here in the corner doing our online moderation. Elliot's also from the Research Commons, and I believe Elliot suggested this next question to us because he does a lot of work with podcasting in the UW libraries.
Yes. So this next question is about podcasting that we teach in the UW libraries. So sometimes we break down genres of podcasts in terms of how many voices are present. So you could have a solo voice podcast, which is kind of like performing a story or an essay, or you could have a podcast with a host who brings on folks to interview. You can have a panel of people on a podcast who discuss things like current events or sports, or you could have co-hosts who bring on different guests. So what made you go with the format that you use?
Yeah, so again, it was an accidental podcast. I knew that I didn't have the skills on my own to do this sort of Twitch, well, I didn't even know it was going to be Twitch, but live streamed commentary. So I sort of threw out this question to my colleagues who's in, and Alex joined. And so at first it was her and I, and then we sort of realized that there was topics we wanted to get into where we didn't have the expertise. And so we started inviting people. It's like, oh, we really want to talk about what's going on with people claiming that these things have passed the bar exam. Well, we need a legal scholar if we're going to actually have that conversation. And what I found, speaking of number of voices, is, and I've been guests on many other podcasts, and sometimes the thing is they're really there just to interview you, and all the host is doing is asking interview questions, and that's not us, right? We're having a conversation, and then our guest or guests are sort of additional voices, and that means that it's actually hard to even have two guests. 4 voices, it's hard to make enough space in the format. With 3, we can do it. Occasionally we have a guest who seems to just assume it's their podcast, and that's a little annoying. But yeah, it's not exactly interviews so much as we're hanging out, having a conversation, and then if we want to talk about a topic where we need some additional expertise, we bring in that other person.
I'm curious, following up on that, how you identify the different guests to bring on.
Yeah. So sometimes it is people who reach out to us, but mostly it is through our own network, because it's a big trust thing, right? We want someone who brings expertise, who's going to not put out messages that we couldn't stand behind. Like we will occasionally disagree with guests, but not very much. So it is largely through our network. And in many cases, that network is actually built through social media and public scholarship and the people that we interact with.
All right, I believe this is going to be our last prepared question, at least for a bit. So start thinking about your questions. So I listen to a bunch of podcasts. Some I just dabble in, some I listen to every episode, and none of them do this inclusion of comments from the live chat thing that you and Hanna do. I just think it's so unique and fun, and it brings in a level of real-time user engagement that I'm not really seeing in my other podcasts. So how did you decide to include it, and what are the logistics? Because I imagine the logistics are fairly complex.
So the biggest complexity in the logistics is that I work on a laptop. And I am the one who's, this is also starts off as video, and there's videos for all of these too. I know we're talking about podcasts, which is ears, but so I'm always sharing the documents that we're looking at, and I've got to keep the chat open over here so I can still see it, and that's pretty small. But again, not so much a decision as sort of the way this grew, because we were starting on Twitch. Twitch already has this culture of there being a chat and people commenting. And it turns out that we attracted a wonderful group of live viewers who often have really insightful and pithy things to say. And so we just kind of keep an eye on it. I have to say that our producer will also keep an eye on it. And so sometimes she's the one who catches something to bring in. I guess the other logistical issue is time delay, right? So the conversation we're having is maybe 10 seconds behind what's actually going out on Twitch. And then if someone's thinking about something and time to type it, by the time they've written something, it's referring back to something at least a couple minutes beforehand. And so there's sometimes something really great will go by and we just can't work it in because we've moved on too much. And it's most difficult in the all hell episodes. So we have this thing at the end of most episodes. Well, in fact, I think we started a few episodes in called Fresh AI Hell, which is just rapid fire. Here's some terrible things that have come up. And we get a backlog of those things. And so we've done 3 now, I think, where we just do a whole hour of that. And so it's super rapid fire. And so the chat is often about something 1 or 2 items before, but if it's funny enough, we'll make the connection.
I enjoy those in sort of a terrible way. Yeah. Okay, well, I think at this point we can open things up to all of you. So maybe do you have one online? Okay, let's start with the one online since it's already there, and then we can alternate. Yeah. So there you go.
So we have a comment. Fresh AI hell is the best bit, and then the question is, can Emily talk a bit about the process of working with the producer, finding a space to host the podcast, etc.? What kind of budget do you have?
Yeah. So. The podcast is supported by the Distributed AI Research Institute, which is the independent research institute that Dr. Timnit Gebru started up. She announced its opening on the first anniversary of having been fired from Google. And if you remember the story of her firing from Google, it was connected to a paper that she and I co-authored along with some other people. So that's the connection to DARE, and I'm a faculty affiliate of DARE. And so I actually don't have budgetary details, but I think another really important thing about how we found our producer is roller derby, right? So like I said, Alex, roller derby for a long time, which means she has this wonderful network of people with all different kinds of professions and skills. And so it was actually through, so Alex and Christy knew each other already from Derby, and that's how that connection happened. In terms of other logistics, it's just very much, we wanted to make this happen, and so we did it. We found time in our schedule. I do a lot of the promos online, so of upcoming live streams of the episodes that drop. That's sort of the part that I've picked up. Alex handles actually hiring someone to be the producer and things like that. And then we do a lot of in just a group chat with our producer in the background. Oh, could you believe this thing that we just saw? And that's where the Fresh AI Health stuff collects first.
I'm going to run the mic out here. Ooh.
Hi. Is it on?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. Nice. Yeah, so I had a question about Twitch, actually. I've used Twitch to watch a lot of streams quite a bit, but I guess I've never really seen it as a tool for like getting your research out or doing public scholarship, and I wanted to know a little more, like, why did you decide on Twitch and how do you like using it?
Yeah. So again, that goes back to the sort of accidental podcast origins. We started doing Twitch because that's what Alex knew how to do from the Derby context. And I think that it, on its own, doesn't have enough reach, right? So we were initially taking the recorded videos and putting them up on YouTube, and then we got fed up with YouTube, and so you can find the videos on PeerTube, which is sort of the Fediverse version of YouTube. Fediverse. So Fediverse, thank you for asking, is a collection of platforms that are sort of distributed rather than centrally hosted. So if you know Mastodon, it's often sort of like the center, or the first thing that people know. So it's a Twitter-like social network. PeerTube is like YouTube. I'm sure there's other things too. So it's a distributed protocol. So we were sort of getting stuff out that way, and it felt like we could have more traction if we turned it into a podcast, which is how the podcast happened.
Other questions?
Hi, I wanted to ask if you personally had a favorite episode that you've done or subject matter you've discussed in the process so far.
It's an interesting question. Maybe one of my favorites is we got to do an exchange with Charlie Jane Anders and Annalee Newitz from Our Opinions Are Correct. So we were on their show and they were on ours. And when they were on our show, we were talking about Asimov's laws of robotics and how they're getting taken up by, like, there was I think it was a DARPA call for proposals that was actually focused on something like the laws, and it had like Asimov as the acronym. And so we were ridiculing that. I haven't said one of our catchphrases yet, which is ridicule as praxis. And that one's due to Alex, and I think it sums it up very nicely. So then when we were on their show, we were talking about the Turing test and why isn't all that. And that pair was actually a lot of fun. But, honestly, I think my favorite one's the next one, because I always look forward to doing this.
All right, another question from the chat. How has your work in public scholarship been received in or by more traditional academia, in scare quotes?
Yeah.
That's a good one.
It's been well received, and I need to sort of say that I started doing this post-tenure. So I can kind of do whatever I want, but it's, this is, my public scholarship has led to me being very active with the media, and so from my own disciplinary context, I think to a large extent, linguists are excited to see linguistics having an impact. And I'm not the only one. There's actually, linguists are pretty public scholarship forward, so I think that's been well received. And I should say that, so public scholarship has led to me talking to the media a lot. Also, my co-authors getting fired over our paper brought a lot of media attention. So it's not all stuff that I can take credit for. But so that was, the Stochastic Parrots paper was published in March of 2021, but it was sort of became a news story in December of 2020, when first Tim Neat and then a couple months later Meg were fired as a result. And there was constant media attention for a few months after Tim Neat got fired. And then in late November 22, when ChatGPT was released, I was already sort of a known person for the media to come to about this. And I counted between January and June of 23, 5 work days with no media contact. So it has been a lot. And that includes, like, a journalist emailed me and I didn't get back to them because I didn't have time. Like, I'm not like, I talk to the media every single day. And I think that in general, sort of my colleagues here at the University of Washington and, in my field across institutions are happy to see linguistics having an impact.
Other questions?
I have one.
Oh.
I have actually personally used ChatGPT. I just tried DeepSeek. I've tried Perplexity. I've tried Claude. So another one, Google kind of adds it in if you want when you do your search. They seem to work well enough. As you just noted, this is a 2-year-old. I mean, and they're functioning at the level of like a senior in college. So I'm curious where you feel the kindness. Now, one more piece. I saw someone do a demo like soon after the first one rolled out in 2022. She actually wrote a grant just using very minimal prompts and letting ChatGPT fill in the grant. And I'm a grant writer, I was at the time, and I sat back at the internet demo and I thought, holy crap, I'm out of a job. You know, I felt like a typesetter when, PageMaker came in.
Yeah. So several things to say there. The first is that they are very flashy demos, right? It's impressive to look at. But I think that it is, to say that ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude and all the rest of them are at the level of a college student, mistakes the textual output that we produce when we are studying and learning and having conversations and doing our work with the actual learning and work that's happening there and the thinking. And one of my other areas of research these days is together with Chirag Shah here in the Information School and also Nora Lindemann, who's a PhD student in Germany, looking at information behavior and the information ecosystem and how synthetic media can be disruptive to that. And so if you, in fact, just this morning I was talking to a journalist whose query had to do with putting in both English and Spanish into some of these chatbots questions about ICE raids that immigrant communities are justifiably terrified by right now. And what they were finding was that they were getting different information out if they asked in English or asked in Spanish. And what I said to him was, I have so much empathy for the people who are going through this terrible thing that's happening right now. And we absolutely should not be making the lives of immigrants insecure. Like, this is terrible. And it's a situation where people desperately want information and might not have reliable sources they can go to. And the problem is that something like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude are actually worse than nothing, because the answers they give you back, you can't situate in terms of where they came from. There's no accountability, and these systems are not set up to say, I don't know. So when there is no information available, you can get something out that sounds authoritative and maybe comforting or maybe frightening, depending on what's going on. And in fact, the answer was, there's no information available now, but you get this other thing instead. And so I'm very concerned about people using the information access. And you sort of mentioned in your question there, so where is the con? My book called The AI Con. And the con is really in, many levels, but one thing is saying a synthetic text extruding machine is good enough to do your job. And the people who are really being taken in by that con are the decision makers who might say, yes, I don't have to pay for these people anymore, I'm going to use the synthetic text machine. And then the victims of the con are the people who lose their jobs over it. And the people for whom those services were meant to be provided who are getting less good services because it's not actually done by a thoughtful human. Thanks for the question.
Right, so let me make sure. So we have a couple of comments. One comment is, I'm not quite sure what the Cheese Mart brochure is, but we have a recent example with Gemini and the Cheese Mart brochure copy commercial. Gemini produced the same text featured on an archived version of the Cheese Mart's page on smoked Gouda. And we have another comment. There's a great new site by fellow UW professors Jevin West and Carl Bergstrom, thebullshitmachines.com. Wonder if there are opportunities for collaboration there. And then we have a question. Apart from identifying topics, how else do you and the team prepare for a podcast episode?
Yeah. All right, so the cheese mark thing is, I guess in Google's Super Bowl ad, they had yet another example of their system, their synthetic text extruding machine, putting out something that was demonstrably false. I think it was something like Gouda accounts for 40 to 60% of cheese consumption. And like, you would only have to actually read that to know that it needed fact checking, right? Like, no specialized knowledge required. Where's all this Gouda? And yet, right, the companies are so proud of this, and it's so flashy that they somehow, like, this gets out there into highly produced ads. So with respect to Jevon and Carl, we actually have collaborated already a little bit. There's an article that recently came out in PNAS about the connection between large language models and science, the processes of science and scholarship, and what the connection should be. And it was meant to be this like multiple different perspectives. And so the three of us co-authored the perspective of like, they don't belong. Like, don't. And that was really fun. So sorry, the last question was how do we prepare?
Yeah, aside from identifying the topic,
Yeah.
maybe logistically.
Yeah. So if we're going to have a guest, we sort of loop the guest in, and then we say, okay, well, this is the topic. We need to find some artifacts. And sometimes we have guests who have not been on our show before, and sometimes we have guests who've listened, right? So do they know what it's going to be or not? So we sort of explain that we need to have 1 to 3 central artifacts that we are going to be making fun of. So it can't be their paper on the topic that they want to share. That's not what we're going after, right? So we identify those and then read them ahead of time. And so usually it's a pretty much of a scramble, in the hours ahead of the podcast to make sure that we've read the thing so that we know sort of what's there that we're going to want to jump on. I do the work of collating a few Fresh AI Hell items, and then we always have our guests join us 15 minutes early in sort of a green room situation so that we can discuss the layout of things before we go live at our advertised stream time, which is usually noon on Mondays, not every week. And we'll do things like making sure we know how to pronounce their name, which is important. And one question that I sort of happened to ask early on, and it worked really, really well, is I say to the guests, is there one point you really want to be sure comes across? And in the sort of the first time I asked it, it was a super important point, and we hadn't gotten to it. So as we were getting close to the end, I was able to prompt the guests to bring that out. A question in the room.
Thanks. Actually, the thing that you just mentioned made me think, you've been working on this for a while, and you're talking about your process and how you've iterated and amended things as you've gone along. Can you talk a little bit about that learning process when you look back to your earliest episodes and then think now, what have you what have you learned? What do you look back on and say, oh God, I can't believe we did that at the beginning? I mean, not that. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe you're like, we were perfect from the beginning.
Yeah, no, we were definitely not perfect from the beginning. And I like to tell people it's an accidental podcast because the sound quality at the beginning was not great. So if you're the kind of person who really cares about sound quality in podcasts, you might start from the point where we had a producer, which is like episode 8 or so. I think the biggest lesson is that we keep running into technical difficulties at airtime. And so if you're going to have something that's like live streamed at a specific pre-announced time, then it's important to have enough time to sort out the kinks beforehand. So for example, the very first episode, we were talking for 20 minutes before we learned that there was no sound getting across. And so we had to roll back and start again. And just our most recently recorded one, so we just recorded a couple weeks ago, episode 50. The latest one to drop in the podcast is 49. So 50 is coming, and it's only 45 minutes long because there was some update to some software somewhere, Chrome or OBS or Riverside, and our producer couldn't hear us. And so at a last minute scramble, Alex had to get Twitch up and running again, and it took about 15 minutes, so we lost some time there. So I think that's sort of one of the big lessons. And I guess another thing that we sort of learned to do over time, because we didn't know we were making a podcast in the beginning, is to actually read the things we're reacting to. Because initially it was video, right? So it's just on screen and we're just talking about it. And then once we decided this was also a podcast, we sort of changed the habit a little bit so that we would lift up the things that we were talking about. And every once in a while we hit something where it's really hard to read. It's like, do I actually have to pronounce this out loud? And then there's this question of okay, is someone going to take that clip of my voice saying this terrible thing? And so, how do we sort of interrupt frequently enough so that nobody's got that one long clip?
We might have lost connection with our online people. We should not have asked that question.
Oh no! The technical gremlins, yeah.
Is the recording happening locally, or is the recording? Okay, so the recording's still going. Good.
Can we get on Twitch?
Can I ask a less vital question while we're reconnecting? This was on our backup questions. I wasn't sure we would get to ask it, but I'm curious if there are podcasts that sort of inspired your own podcast, or also just like what other podcasts do you think are really good?
Yeah. So the ones that I make sure to listen to every single episode of, You're Wrong About is a favorite of mine, and that's obviously not an uncommon answer. It's a super popular podcast. Sarah Archer, right? Sarah Marshall. Yeah, there was some. She had Sarah Marshall was just on Livewire. I heard that over the weekend. It was really fun to hear her talking about her podcast. I also like Michael Hobbs's other things. So If Books Could Kill is fun, and I guess we are sort of similar to If Books Could Kill, though I think we're older than them. And really enjoy some of the other tech critical podcasts. So Tech Won't Save Us with Paris Marx. There was, it's ended now, but a wonderful podcast called the Radical AI Podcast that was produced by a couple of grad students in Colorado. I got to be on that in its early days, and I really enjoyed sort of the perspectives that they brought in. I'm not a big fan of the sort of like audio or video essay style thing. I like the ones that are more conversational. Another long-standing podcast in linguistics is Lingthusiasm, and they do super thoughtful, what they call lingcom, so linguistics communication, with things like they will limit the number of technical terms they introduce in an episode, and they are sure to like describe the concept first and then give it a name rather than the other way around. We don't follow those rules, but yeah. So this is something that I like.
Cool, thanks. More things to add to my list. How are we doing? Are we good? Are we back?
We do have a question.
Okay, great. Well, let's jump right to them.
Right. Sorry about that, online people. But they are all really, really nice and understanding, and so I'm going to apologize about that. So this question that we have, if you could reverse engineer the accidental podcast and or share takeaways for scholars who would like to do more public scholarship, what would you suggest? What would you not suggest?
Well, this is just a sort of low-level technical thing. We started, so definitely suggest thinking about accessibility. And so we, even from that very first Twitch stream, made sure to have transcription. And we initially hired a person to do it, thinking this is the kind of thing we're going to value human effort. And turns out, and then the other thing is transcripts from the get-go. So for the early episodes, I was doing the correction of the transcripts, and then now our producer does it. Turns out, if you want a transcript that stays very close to what's happening in the actual audio, it's easier to start with automatic transcription. I recommend certainly thinking about accessibility. That's very important. I would say it is, I think, a good thing to have the live stream format. I know you have some questions in there about editing too. Basically, what you see is what you get. We do only a tiny little bit of editing. Our producer sort of puts music for the intro and outro and like makes the sound levels match between the different voices. And that's kind of it. And that if you are the sort of, if you have any of the perfectionist tendencies that are kind of rampant in academia, that might feel really hard, right? It's like, you just, whatever we said, all the false starts, all that kind of stuff, it's got to be out there. But it also keeps it contained, right? If you want to make an hour of content and you want it to be smooth and well edited, that's way more work than we've done a live stream and now you can listen to it.
So I really enjoy Alex's musical.
Oh, right.
So we could talk about that longer.
Yeah. I don't remember how that started, but we do this thing where when we do segue into Fresh AI Hell, I give Alex an improv prompt and she does it. And I'd say about at least half of them are musical, and it's just us being silly. And we have this idea, we haven't done it yet, but we hope that at some point there'll be enough of our producer's time to make a supercut of all of those transitions. And it is, I think, part of the it's not exactly gallows humor, but the ridicule is praxis. It's hard stuff that we're looking at, but we're having fun doing it. And that helps with the community building. I think it helps keep spirits up. And Alex is amazing. I think there's a question in the back, too.
There's an online one, too.
Yeah.
In the spirit of accessibility, I'm wondering if you know how much of your audience has no graduate education or maybe even no post-secondary education, and what you do to make the live stream or the podcast accessible to those folks.
Yeah. I don't have that kind of information. I know that we certainly have a lot of people who are in academia, and also a lot of people who are educators at other levels. And I think the main thing that we do towards accessibility just comes from being interdisciplinary. So Alex and I have different backgrounds, and so we are sort of likely to catch each other and ask questions. Our producer will sometimes, we have the group chat going while we're podcasting or while we're streaming, and she'll say, "Can you explain that?" So we'll get little pokes. And certainly in writing the book, which we intend to be accessible to broad audiences, we were sort of on the lookout for the other one using technical terms or writing against presuppositions that maybe would fly within our fields, but not outside.
All right, this one's from the chat. What advice would you give to undergrads for pivoting their career in a meaningful direction while staying relevant to current technologies? And then there's a bit of a note after, and this person says, as someone who deeply cares about the future of the world and wondering where to go with all of this information.
Yeah, so one big suggestion is think about going into policy. So bring your technical skills and then sort of learn what you need to learn to be either writing policy, so becoming a policymaker, or doing the kind of activism that influences policy. I think that there's a lot of need for people who have the training with various kinds of technology, but want to be shaping the ways in which technology gets developed through political action and activism.
That makes me wonder with a follow-up question for that. You'd mentioned earlier in your talk about going to Capitol Hill, and I was wondering, how did that come about? Was it because of your podcast that you were recognized and invited, or were there other things that you've done to kind of reach out to public policymakers?
I suspect that it is more through being in the media, like the more traditional media, rather than the podcast itself. But yeah, I eventually sort of got myself into the lists of people who are known. So when policymakers say we need to be informed on this, and I think a lot of it also is networking. So there's people that I know either because I met them while they were doing the same thing on Capitol Hill, or sort of through these conversations online. And so sometimes, I'll get a request that I can't fulfill myself. Like, well, how about so-and-so, and that kind of stuff. So the podcast may have helped, but I wouldn't say it was sort of the primary ingredient there.
I'm curious with that too. How would you go about preparing to talk to policymakers? Do you have recommendations for folks who are interested in doing some of that policy work?
Yeah. So the first thing I think is to sort of come up with talking points. What is the main thing that you want conveyed? And a second thing, and this is true for policymakers and it's also true for the media, is to stay grounded in your own expertise. Once you sort of become known as one of the people that folks will go to, people will come at you with questions that don't necessarily map to your expertise. And so I can't answer that as actually a really important answer to be able to have. And then, after that, it's a time commitment. So sort of it's a question of prioritizing, do I have time to do that? And also sort of becoming knowledgeable about timescales. And there are, groups working on this. So there's something called, I think, the Washington Privacy Network that's interested in privacy law. So you can sort of get involved in these groups and learn about what's going on, how do bills get written, and there's like sort of a lot to learn about the actual practice that can influence what you do.
Are there other questions from the audience?
So my question, I do find that when I listen to podcasts, I love the content, or I love the segments, or I love the storytelling, but sometimes I do find that I really just love the voices. I love the rapport. I love the relationships, and I feel like the more I listen to your podcast, the more just you and Alex really comfort me or really entertain me. Like I just like how you sound. I could just have that in the background and not even be listening to what you're saying, and it brings me a lot of like joy. And so I just wonder kind of, and both of you are very funny. Like there's a lot of improvisation, and now I kind of, knowing more about Alex's kind of history with roller derby. I mean, it seems like people who do roller derby, that's a very useful skill for lots of things in life. And so I just wonder, is this totally something that just happens because it's chemistry and you two get along, or do you work at all on just improvisation? Because I think you both are really good at, you're very knowledgeable, but you're good communicators, but you're also, there's like an element of, it's like a show, it's fun, there's improv involved.
Yeah. Well, thank you. First of all, that's lovely to hear. And here's a fun fact. Alex and I have yet to meet in person. We're going to fix that this year. On the book tour, if not before. But no, actually, I have an event she's in the Bay Area, and I have an event in the Bay Area in March. So I'm pretty sure we will actually finally meet in March. I think it's really just more about like shared purpose and mutual respect. And so I think that part of what makes that a fun space is that we have this shared goal and a lot of respect for each other's knowledge and sort of turns of phrase and things like that. And so in some ways, the most awkward parts of the podcast are when we collide and then it's like, no, you go, no, you go, no, you go. And so trying to like keep that to a minimum is honestly the hardest thing, I think, to make the flow feel good, especially because we're not editing anything.
Well, why don't you tell us about the book?
The AI Con, folks who are here in person and got here early, you got stickers. Anybody who wants a sticker at the end, I got them with me. It is coming out with HarperCollins on May 13th. And it is, we wrote it pretty quickly. We finished the manuscript last September, having started writing in earnest in March. So it was a pretty mad dash. Definitely made possible by the podcast. So we sort of took all the various things that we've been seeing and grouped them into categories and then made the structure of the book out of that. It's been great to work with Alex on the book. A lot of, one of the downsides of publishing with sort of general audiences, big five publishers, is that they need things in Microsoft Word. And I haven't willingly used Microsoft Word since about 1996. So we were actually writing in Markdown, and then Alex found a system that projects out from Markdown to Word. And when we got to the galley stage, it was in PDF, and we were happy again. But a lot of back and forth and sort of, like I was saying before, smoothing out each other's presuppositions and prose. So I think it hopefully reads pretty clearly. Hopefully it's got some of the same sense of humor as the podcast. And our goal really is to help people understand what's going on right now with the hype in a way that in the next hype cycle, you're going to be able to use the same lessons. And so it's a book of this moment, but it's meant to have some durability. And we'll see.
And will there be any events for the book tour and book release on campus? Do you know yet?
I haven't planned anything on campus.
Or in Seattle.
In Seattle. So May 19th at Elliott Bay Book Company on Capitol Hill, and then May 20th at Third Place Books up in Lake Forest Park. Book comes out on May 13th. We're going to have a launch event with DARE just in the week beforehand. DARE is the Distributed AI Research Institute. And you can find all the information. The events page isn't live yet, but it'll be there on thecon.ai, which is our book URL. It's on these stickers online, folks. It's easy, thecon.ai. And again, that's Alex's genius of looking for and snagging that URL.
It's exciting. Yes.
So do you avoid using AI at all in your work, or where do you really use it, if you use it at all?
What does AI mean to you? What are you referring to?
Well, I was referring to just listening to you prepare a book. When I've written things, I've pushed it into AI and I say, correct the spelling, correct the grammar, leave it as it is, and put it in active voice. And it'll just take a second and spit it back out, and I double check it. It's my own writing. So I'm not asking for research or deep, copying of New York Times article. So I'm curious in the preparation for the book, for the opportunities where you saw an opportunity to put it to use, and you chose to use it or not to use it, and what was the basis of that flex?
So depending on what we're referring to with AI, definitely not. I mean, we certainly used a spell checker, but spell checkers are old technology and not anything that's usually called AI these days. And I don't know that we actually even used a grammar checker. And for things like formatting references, so here's something else about the book and something that's very uncomfortable as an academic. We want to cite all of our sources, right? And you can't, like in my field, we usually just do like parenthetical name date citations. Well, that's not going to fly in a popular. We couldn't even have like numbered endnotes. There's endnotes, like the back, maybe 25% of the book is endnotes, but you have to know to look for them. And then they're anchored with anchor phrases on the page. So, but even for things like formatting the references, this was done with the assistance of some automation, right? You can have Zotero or something that's got a database, and then you can say, format this as APA or format this as whatever, but I wouldn't call that AI. And certainly not ChatGPT. One interesting question, and I should go double check this because I'm going to get asked this question again, is there any synthetic text in the book at all? And the only context in which there would be some would be if we were quoting something that we had to talk about for some reason. But I do my best not even to consume it or read it. So the answer is, depending on what you mean by AI, no, not at all.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one more question. Do you have anything online, Elliot?
Someone did.
Wait.
We lost the chat, the sound. But just, I guess another question would be, in your teaching, do you use podcasts? Do you teach with that genre?
Yeah. I will sometimes refer to podcasts. So the Radical AI podcast, a little bit less so recently because it's ended, though it's still fantastic. I still recommend it. They're great episodes. And then I found myself in the last few months frequently referring to the Tech Won't Save Us series called Data Vampires, investigating the environmental impacts of data centers, which is where the so-called AI runs. And that's very, very valuable. So I can't say that I have ever assigned a podcast, but it's certainly a big source of information for me. And so when we're in conversation with students and someone says, well, is there anything that you know where I can look? And I'm like, oh, well, there's this podcast. Yeah. And there's some of my students in the room. I think they can probably attest to that having happened. Yeah.
All right. Are there any last questions? Okay. If not, I want to thank Dr. Bender again for joining us today for our Fireside Chat.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, and make sure to check out her book, The AI Gone.